All right. I don't have any socks other than the ones on my feet, and I'm sure you don't want those. So for those of you that have, so it's been awesome to be here. Like over the last 48 hours, I've had just some of the best conversations, honestly, with real like individual contributors, technical decision makers, talking about real things. Like every single conversation has been amazing. And it's rare that you find that in any sort of conference. It's been awesome. And judging by the conversations I've had, all of you are enjoying it as well. And all the event organizers like Scott and Chris and everybody that's been involved, it's been so smooth. Such a nice conference. So a little about me, I guess. My name's William. I work for a startup called Alkira. We build a network platform on software. And we're really automation friendly, which is one of the reasons I love working there. And I also host the Cloud Gambit podcast with Yvonne Sharp. And if I'm not doing those two things, I'm usually buried in like young children at home, cleaning up Spit Up and all that fun stuff. And I like competitive ice hockey, so I play ice hockey as well. So enough about that. Building the business case for automation. So I'm here to talk about people. And this is actually this is kind of a hard talk for me. Usually my talks are more technical, live coding, like talking about nuts and bolts stuff. But if I look back at I zoom out and look at the entirety of my career, the people, the process, the bureaucracy, all of those things, learning how to navigate that stuff was, a lot of times the hardest part. That's what I want to dive into today. And even though I worked for a startup over the past 3 years, most of my time was spent in enterprise, so 15 years for some pretty large companies. So as far as an agenda, I want to look at the agility of bicycles versus trains. Of course, these are very different. I want to tie them back to the business and what that sort of looks like. And then extending the OSI model, adopting layer 8 is part of the OSI model. So taking it from being the joke that we all make it, for many, many years to, bringing it in and actually using it as an advantage to get things across the finish line. And then, hey, even though you work with people, even though you have good ideas, even though you've got it all figured out, if you work for a big company, you have to have some measure of influence. You have to build that influence and work with other folks that have that influence to really move the needle. And then capitalizing on opportunity, knowing what opportunity looks like. Sometimes it's not as simple as a CIO coming down from the ivory tower and stopping by your cubicle and saying, "Hey, William, what's up?" No, it's much more complicated than that. So finding opportunities and understanding and preparing for those opportunities. So I want to add a little context. So generally when you categorize companies these days, they usually take annual revenue and like employee count. So like an enterprise is technically considered somewhere north of like $1 billion in revenue and usually over 1,000 employees. And enterprise has mid-market, smaller. Usually I think it's like in between 30 million and $1 billion in revenue, usually less than 1,000 employees. And then of course you've got the FANG companies, which are the gigantic ones, AWS, Microsoft, and even outside of FANG, like there's some retailers like Walmart would be an example of a large enterprise. So specifically the companies I worked for, like these were sort of the baseline. So 20 to 100 billion revenue, 20 to 60,000 employees. And one key thing is like how many applications does a company manage? Like how many applications are in production? How many lines of business? Like all that stuff adds a lot of complication to how you build and run that infrastructure to support these things. So on to the fun part. So the agility of bicycles versus trains. So something I realized when starting off actually with a small company way back and then going to enterprise space. Enterprises can be challenging. Like there's a really high inertia to overcome at a large enterprise. There's lots of things going on, and I like to compare enterprise to like a train. Like there's miles and miles of track. You have steel rails, and like if you want to turn and do anything, you have these like switches and turnouts and stuff that all have to be adjusted. It's really hard to change directions with a train, whereas if I'm on my bicycle riding down the neighborhood and I want to change direction, I just turn around, say I want to go back and eat goldfish at the house. I just turn my bike around, go back home. I'm addicted to goldfish now because of kids, so yeah, I get my goldfish fix. You know, it's very, very easy to pivot. And then kind of like taking that a step further, you know, one thing I realized, especially in the startup space and, you know, smaller companies, it's like your individual decisions and like how you want to approach things, you have a lot more, I guess, visibility, and those decisions really matter, and you can do things with them. And you can pivot and go different directions and try new things. So I'm riding my bike and I want to go down a different trail. Okay, I turn and I go down a different trail, test some things out, you know, build some feedback loops, and, you know, provide value by looking at different things. But when I'd say the larger the company, you know, especially with enterprise, like it's decision by committee, like a lot of the time. Like group consensus is like the name of the game, and this can be challenging. And there's so many, there's lots of people involved, you know, so back to the turning the train thing, like there's so many people at each step that have to be involved. Things have to be in sync. You have security related things. You have all this stuff that's stacked up to do a lot of simple things. It's a fixed path. Like all these rails are laid out and you have this fixed direction that this train's going, and it's really hard to change that direction. So then another thing, of course, so this is fairly obvious, but you know, startup, of course, or a smaller company, there's going to be less people. When you have less people, the decision chain and the flow of information is much more simple. Whereas, you know, with an enterprise, like the communication chain, the flow of information, it's pretty complicated. So understanding that, and so like a few years ago, well, it's been about 4 years, I guess, I was mentoring someone, and I ended up, so he was working for a really small company at the time, managing like a network. I think they had like 5 or 6 switches. It was like tiny. And so I ended up helping him, and he was able to get a job at an enterprise. And so we had a sync up like 4 months later, and I actually reached back out to him to try to remember exactly what he had said, but this is directly from him. Like, no matter how hard I work, I can't seem to make impacting change, William. Why is that? You know? And it's kind of funny because like in my experience in enterprise, a lot of times like that 4 months, I usually don't even have all my access and all the stuff that I need to do my job still. Like things tend to move like very, very slow. And that's one thing working for a large company, there's a lot of time invested. Like a lot of folks have said today, it's a journey. It really is. It's really hard to move these things along. And so another thing is, why is it that bad ideas always make it across the finish line so easy? And this one really resonated with me, and I hear this a lot, and I'm going to go a little off script here, not that I had a script, but like a good example of this one is I worked for a large company, and we probably worked for like a year and a half, and we finally got automation, network automation on a roadmap at a very high level. We had some measure of like institutional buy-in, and we had a budget. Things were going really smooth, and it was the hard part in this scenario was my biggest stumbling block was actually the network team. They didn't want to change anything. They didn't want automation. I remember actually on one specific call, like our principal architect was basically like, William, we're not Google. That's exactly what he said to me, and the conversation proceeded from there. But once they figured out that this was going to happen anyway, from the top down, they actually went and talked to a vendor. That vendor brought in a box. That box automated a very, we were multi-vendor, multi-tenant. We had a very sizable environment. And this box automated like just the branch, and it was a very small subset of the actual vendors and OSs and things that we had. But you know what happened? That vendor came in with beautiful slides, a beautiful story. And they told that story, and they had that network architect, and they told the story better than I could at the time. And so what happened there, we basically prototyped this thing, And it was like a 4 or 5 month loss of time. So we went and we established, okay, this solves like 2 or 3% of what we actually need to do. We're going to come back and, what I had set up, like we were using Ansible Tower because we didn't have not a lot of folks that knew how to code. So I was trying to make it like, okay, how do I get people to contribute? And it was the right fit for us at that time. So this is a challenge. I overcame these things through honestly, a lot of work and a lot of grinding and a lot of dealing with people. And if I can do it, anybody in the world can. So extending the OSI model to layer 8. So I love this quote by Sun Tzu. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. What does that mean? It means you got to be prepared. So when an opportunity does come your way, you're prepared and you can capitalize on that. So, again, going off track, but kind of I thought it was funny. I don't know if you all will, but I was on Twitter. It was like either earlier this year or like the end of last year, and there was this tweet. And this person had a gigantic following, and he had this tweet that said, for you all that are using the OSI model in your PowerPoint slides, stop it. You are the problem. This is outdated. And I took offense to that. I love the OSI model. It's amazing. Like I've taught my children to like ride their bikes through the lens of the OSI model. I use it all the time. And so from that point, I've used the OSI model in like more slide decks this year than like ever in my life. So one thing that's true about this though, and one thing I see a lot of is, network engineers, for better or for worse, they live at layer 2 and layer 3 a lot of the time. And as you start to move up the OSI model, you start going up those layers, there's hesitancy to get involved there. And this is actually kind of changing. So there's been a lot of movement with like application networking, cloud and all this stuff. And I'll let you in on a little secret. This is going to blow your mind. But application networking is actually just networking. Believe it or not, reverse proxy, load balancer, the infamous DNS. How many of you all know what those things are? Not that scary, is it? But I mean, the tools and the interactions and the way that you deploy these things and manage the life cycle is different. But hey, it's networking. But I do know one thing. If I go back, and the higher up the OSI model you go, when you hit that layer 8, that is like the butt end of every joke. If I had a dime for every time over the past 20 years that I've heard a network engineer say, I got into networking so I didn't have to work with people. I could go and buy a Bitcoin right now, which is like some crazy $100,000, it's just massively expensive. But I mean, that's a serious problem because if we don't talk to people and we don't know how to communicate and articulate our ideas and get institutional buy-in, then to me, and in my experience anyway, automation is a science project. And then when I leave that company, guess what dies? The little bits of automation that I did. So layer 8, rules and protocols. We love protocols, right? So protocols are applicable, I would say, to people as well. So when you think about protocols in general, it's not exclusive to networking. You have a protocol and side A and side B, and it's brokering this sort of communication with this set of rules. Well, people are like that too. An organization with as much structure on paper and all this stuff, it's very much matrixed. There's a lot of organizational politics that dictate a lot of things. So the second side of the human layer is interfaces. Yeah, we configure interfaces all day, but the one problem, and one thing I used to my advantage just time and time again was talking to the other teams around us, talking to the cloud team. We don't have to hate the cloud team. We don't have to always get into debates with the security team. We really need to partner with them, find that common ground so we can move the needle. And the third thing is encapsulation. Hey, I would say that over the years, and this is something that's really hard to learn, network engineers don't speak the same language as VPs or CISOs or CIOs. It's a different language. We have to learn how to bridge that gap and articulate our ideas better. and then IP addressing schemes. Knowing who to talk to and where they exist in these hierarchies to find the actual power brokers, the folks that can make decisions. So mapping that out is really important. So on to the next thing. So building influence. So we've got all this stuff. We've figured out sort of the mechanics, that we need to talk to people. People are actually important, and being able to talk to different teams and understand what they do and dig into their world is actually going to help us. So I love this quote: growth and comfort do not coexist. And I have to say that probably the most intense conversations I ever had working in enterprise IT was trying to get network automation over the finish line. Because a lot of times, there's a part of the population that doesn't want to change. They get into this comfort zone, and they want to stay in that comfort zone. When you start throwing darts and you change up their routine, you got to learn this now, you got to learn that. And I totally understand that. I feel that way sometime. But I have to say that when I decided that I want to work in technology, especially network engineering, and network spans so many things nowadays, I have a responsibility to the organization I work for to keep up with the technology, to make sure that we're moving the needle and evolving, so that way the business can evolve. Because if the business is successful, then I'm successful, my team's successful, and it's a snowball effect. So building influence, and one of the things, so this is just a simple example. So on the right, let's just say, this is actually a real example. So this was when cloud was really taking off. So we had an enterprise intake process for new applications or products that we were going to build, and the cloud team was pretty highly automated. So this process was extremely disjointed though. So in order to plug in a CIDR range to the VPC and to the subnets and start carving that out, the DevOps folks had to submit a ticket. The network team would manually provide a prefix, assign it in a tool, and then the cloud team would actually automate the rest of it. And then from that point, on the network side, they were doing, so we had these, it was multi-tenant, we had these different VRFs for different purposes, and we had the route maps for the filtering routes to and from the cloud, and we would basically have to add a prefix to a prefix list, and sometimes add a VLAN to a trunk. It wasn't a ton of changes, but what it was a lot of tickets stacking up across this process. And then security was a completely separate thing. Security wouldn't do anything until our stuff was done. So what ended up happening is something simple like this that honestly shouldn't take more than a day or a night was taking almost over a month in some cases, because of all the change management, because of all the manual touch points. And so what we realized in just talking to our leadership, they would look down from their ivory towers, and they don't care about excuses. They don't want to hear oh, this team does it this way and this other team does it that way. No, they want, okay, you onboarded a new service. We want a cohesive way to automate it end to end. All the technology is here available to us. We just have to put it together and kind of dig through the culture and figure out how to do this. So I guess, why do you need influence? If I had to answer it, good ideas aren't good enough. Good ideas don't do anything. Even execution, you can't even get to the point to where you're executing until you can solve the people there. Because who provides the funding? Who's going to allocate the budget? Who's going to maybe hire some staffing to help you out, or get some consultants, or do all that stuff? That has to happen, from the top down usually. And the next thing is, we need influence so that we can come into these conversations and help bridge that technical and business gap that just seems to exist everywhere. So one really great piece of advice I got a long time ago, it was actually the first time I ever met Russ White, and I was talking to him about sort of a challenge that I had, and he gave me this great advice. I'll remember it forever. It's probably in one of his 1,000 books, but he's like, okay, you're going to work for a new company. Don't just interview, look at the salary, and join the company. If it's a publicly traded company, okay, what do their earnings reports look like? Have they endorsed any vendors? What vendors are they using? Like, do some research and learn about the company, because there's a lot of data out there. And then make your decision. So that always had my wheels spinning, and I took some of that, sort of like some of those ideas, and when you go into these big companies, like this org chart, this is just at the top. Usually you have like a shared services organization that CIO owns. And then under that, you have these different towers, like core infrastructure, end user compute, enterprise architecture. These are just like usually the main ones. And you have like a VP, pointing northbound that's like strategy, vision, and all these things. And then you have an associate VP that's execution. We've got to execute on these visions. And so this formal hierarchy, what is on paper for a big company? Like, how is information supposed to flow? How are decisions supposed to be made? So what is it supposed to look like? And then what I found over the years is you have that, but then you have this sort of informal hierarchy of what is actually happening. And it's usually never the way that it's supposed to work. And a lot of times you have individual contributors or folks that do have influence up and down the org chart that have a lot of power in empowering these decisions. And so one of the reasons that these enterprises are so complicated, like let's say we dig down in the infrastructure bubble here. So under that, guess what? There's another tier of management, of course. I mean, why wouldn't there be? So this is a simplistic example, but say you have like network, cloud, and database, all right? So each one of these is going to have a director. So network will have a director, cloud will have a director, and they'll report to this associate VP usually. And then if you dig down a little bit further, what you're going to find is you're going to find more managers. And those managers are going to have different teams that are actually tactical and executing on things, like at a more nuts and bolts level. So for the sake of simplicity, I just have two teams here, network engineering, network ops. This is a network conference. So that's there's usually actually more management in this structure. This is a very watered down version of what this looks like. And you may be wondering, William, where's security? Like, security and networking are converging. Like, why isn't it a shared responsibility? And you're right, it absolutely is. And what you get typically is another organization within that company that is separate from everything else. So usually, like, I've seen CISOs report directly to CIOs. I've seen CISOs report to CEOs or even to the boards sometimes. And that gives them a level of autonomy, which makes it hard when you do start trying to partner and accomplish things together. When you think of all the different, this matrix, so many different teams, so many different leaders, managers, and sometimes they're trying to build their tower of power and they're not in tune with listening to other ideas. It makes it challenging. So one thing I learned, back to the science experiment, there's many times I started with network automation using like bash scripting and Perl. And honestly, this was like before a lot of people were doing automation, and I only did it. It's funny, there's someone here that I used to work with many, many years ago, actually in a knock, where we were like automating stuff with Perl, and he reached out to me and he's like, hey William, I'm coming to that conference you're speaking at. So we've gotten to catch up, but just like looking back, it's so funny how long ago that was and how like what we're doing today hasn't really changed much, which is kind of crazy. But one thing I realized, if you do want to take it beyond that science experiment, so it doesn't, you want to do that. You don't just want to test out automation. Oh, I'm doing this because it's cool. If you happen to leave a company, you want what you've built and what you put your blood, sweat, and tears in to still be there when you go. So how do you do that? And one thing I found is, if the target is that VP level. So if you can get network automation on a VP's roadmap, that is what I found actually makes it real. And that is that's how you get funding, that's how you get people, that's how you get buy-in. Because guess what? In this huge matrix company, who everybody's not going to listen to is me. But who everybody's going to listen to is everybody in the ivory tower, of course. So how do you do that with all these different layers of management? It's intimidating. It takes a lot of time, and yes, it's a journey, and yes, we have to talk to people. So how do you begin doing that? Well, one thing I did, and actually I've done this a few times across a few companies, is especially in the scenario where I couldn't get the network team to like or want or whatever it is, embrace automation. So at the time, guess who was getting a lot of budget? It was the cloud teams. They were getting a ton of budget. And they actually had a lot of decision-making power. So what did I do? I said, hey, this is when we were on-prem too. Like we're not working from home. So, that was, I guess, kind of one advantage of being able to walk over and say, hey, let's go eat lunch. Let's have a conversation. So partnering with the cloud team, understanding how they worked, and then actually understanding, okay, they actually don't like the network team very much because every time they go and do these changes, they have to wait many times over for all of our artisan, handcrafted notepad to change orders, all this stuff to happen for simple routine changes. And then I'll tell you who has more budget than like anybody on the planet and also has the most gigantic army of people on the planet is security teams. Like security organizations have a lot of budget to play around with and they have a lot of decision-making power. So as you start branching out and you start talking to these teams, you realize that, okay, like you might consider yourself a change agent because you wanted, I don't even like to think about it that way. Like embracing automation shouldn't make you a change agent. It should just make you someone that wants, to do what's right so we can have consistent infrastructure and more reliable infrastructure because there's less snowflake configurations and deployments out there. So these individual contributors and change makers are scattered, they're littered through the entire org chart. But you have to find them and you have to make alliances with them. So it starts off technical. And then so actually real story, back to this scenario, I had a weekly call. So it was like 2 people from the cloud team. It was a few people from security. We even got a person from change management to come in. We had a weekly call because we knew, the network teams and the security teams were getting tons of scrutiny. You're not going fast enough. Cloud is all automated. What are you all doing over there? And just throwing darts right and left. So how do we fix this? So this came down to sort of building a team of, like we just call ourselves the team of champions, but whatever, like the change agents or people that were trying to move the needle or do something strategically within the organization. And then once we're on the same page and we really think through like what is the right thing to do, how are we going to do it, and understanding, like coming to the conclusion that really to get this going, we need budget, we have to have these things, and we really need it on a roadmap if we want to see anything come from it. So then we start educating our managers, and then eventually we work our way up to the directors, and then okay, so we have this good thing going. We're educating, we're sort of working the political system a little bit, and then what? So you can have all the preparation in the world, but hey, you need an audience with the right people to actually make things happen. So I love this quote from Denzel Washington. I say luck is when an opportunity comes along and you're prepared for it. Because when opportunities come along and you're winging it, there's a really small likelihood that you're going to be able to move that forward. So what does an opportunity look like? Well, it's definitely not the CIO coming across in your cubicle and saying, hey, William, you like network automation? Let's do that. That's never going to happen. So how do you get an audience with these very busy folks that have like their calendars blocked out for the end of time? Well, first thing is we have to know how to talk. So network engineers, hey, we live in our IPsec world, our BGP world, our tools and Git and all these things. And this is great. This is what I love doing. But in order to make broader impact, we have to figure out how to speak another language. And I was literally in a meeting one time in person with a senior VP, and my boss at the time came in and started talking. It was like BGP, it was like path prepend and like all this other stuff, and the VP's just like, what? Like that should never happen. Maybe sometimes in some companies you might have technical leadership, but in the enterprise, most of the time, no. But I'll tell you what they do understand. They understand spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are never dying. They're going to be here forever. They understand data points. They understand budgets. They understand ROI. They understand PowerPoints. This is the language they speak. So how do we take that what we're trying to do, this technical vision we have, and how do we articulate that? And this is actually a very challenging thing to do. So the way that I like to approach this was, so again, true story. I sat with our cloud team, and what I began to do is I had this spreadsheet, and then I had a Python script that would actually visualize the data on the spreadsheet into charts and stuff. And I started putting in and sitting with these teams and kind of inventorying how they were doing things. Like, okay, here's the change order. This is how many touch points. This is how long it would take. This is the SLA. Like going through all these things through these change windows and sort of peeling them apart. And what I found was the cloud team was very rough approximation, like 90% automated, which is, hey, it's pretty good. And they don't have to worry about iron, so it's not as hard. But then the network team, it was me and one other person at this organization were the only ones doing any sort of network automation. And I put 25% in here, but I think it was actually less than that. And security was a little less than 15. It was around 15%. So taking this, finding a way, the right data points to show like why these things were taking so long, and then visualizing it in charts, like putting together this sort of data flow so we could speak and convince the folks that understand it that way. And what we found, so the first phase of this obviously is data gathering. And this took a really long time because one challenge here is I was automating things from the network side, but everyone else that was doing changes was not. So I didn't know exactly what they were doing and how long it was taking. So I was staying up and going on these crazy change windows at like 2 a.m. and like, okay, I found out that they were, some of them were using a spreadsheet to concatenate and build configs and pop them out. And then they were copying from the spreadsheet and putting them in notepads. And then they have a notepad for the implementation and a separate notepad with all the no's in front of the commands for the backout. So they're taking those two notepad files and then they're attaching them to a change order. And then they are manually pasting them into a CLI. Okay, so going through, and it was actually really challenging going through all these steps and peeling this apart and turning it into data points to come up with that 25%. But after you get some good usable data, like real data, because it's got to be real, then it's the storytelling. So you can't go, well, it's hard to go and talk to like executive leadership, like at the C level or the VP level, and just say, hey, here's the data. We're doing this thing. Let's go. It's not going to go well. Maybe you could get fired. I don't know. But you have to wrap it in a very compelling narrative. You have to be able to storytell. And I used to think about this like my kids love like campfire storytelling. They like me to make up stories. They don't like me to read stories. They like me to make ones up on the fly. They're usually really random and just crazy. But coming and having like just a real good story behind the data, putting really good data with really good storytelling. And I don't want to say that it's going to work every time, but it's your success rate is going to be much higher. And then the last thing is the opportunity. And there's a few different opportunities that I've seen come along, but the biggest one is honestly outages. So one of the big automation initiatives I got across the board was on the tails of like almost a day and a half outage. There lots of stuff had happened, and when we went through and we were like peeling everything back, it was actually a combination of a few manual changes that had been done, and it was pretty bad. So what I did is, like, since I was a lead architect at the time, I had to go to the gauntlet and get grilled by all the leadership and stuff. But instead of going in and making excuses and saying, hey, we're going to do this better next time, I came in with my data points and I said, look, yeah, this has happened. Well, this is why it happened. Well, what we could do to actually fix this is, this network automation stuff, if we take the human hands out of the equation as much as possible, and then we start deploying the, consistent infrastructure across these teams, what that leads to, and I know we like to think automation is just, okay, we just want to go fast. It's for agility. Yeah. But my value from automation, and what I think is the most valuable for big companies, is getting a consistent infrastructure and increasing your reliability. Because more human hands in, it's almost like your reliability is going to go straight down. So doing everything, taking the human hands out of the equation, having the right data, engaging in the right opportunity, recognizing that opportunity, being prepared. These were all things that I use, and not just for network automation, but for a few different initiatives. Because if there's something that's different, or maybe a little unpopular, but just different, it's really hard to get an organization to buy off on it. So that's about it. If you want to find me, these are my social things, and if you want to listen to the podcast, you can scan that code and subscribe and give it 5 stars. And even if you don't listen, everybody wins. I love it. So thank you. This has been really fun. And if you have any questions, I can take them.
For the people in the room that normally are more technical focused, what would you recommend for like either training or practice to become more layer 8 aware? Like how can you start learning what the directors and VPs want to hear and be able to map your talk track?
That's a great question. I think one thing is, as funny as this may sound, I used to actually I didn't like talking in front of people like earlier on in my career. It made me a little nervous. And I'm not really nervous these days, but one thing that I did is and this is a hard question to answer these days because so many of us work remotely. But being in person, the time and the place that I was going through some of these things, I could walk over and talk to people. I took so many people out to lunch, so many people in the security organizations. And when getting folks from the official office setting into a little less informal setting, whether it's on a Zoom or anything else, then you start opening up the conversation to talk about other things like, oh, your boss reports to so-and-so, oh, you all probably have a lot of budget for this, so who really makes the decisions over there? Do you have a lot of decision-making power? Like I find that over here, I'm struggling with how to move things. So just really genuine, like really authentic approach to talking to people. And the more you talk to people and the more you engage with other teams, I can say this for sure, the easier it does get. And that's the best advice I could probably give there. And then you just slowly work your way up.
Thank you, William.
Absolutely.
Take that.